everyone could take their seats, we will get started. Thank you so much. Apologies for the delay. So good afternoon again. My name is Monique Dixon. I am Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Education, and I'd like to thank you for attending today's UN Permanent Forum on the People of African Descent side event called Ensuring Equal Access to Educational Opportunities Regardless of Race, Color, or National Origin, which is hosted by the United States of America. As we begin, I ask you to please make sure that your electronic devices are turned to silent, your phones and your laptops. We are recording this event and want to make sure that the recordings are clear. There is also a sign-in sheet being circulated. We would appreciate you including your name and affiliation on the sign-in sheet when it comes to you. And now it is my honor to introduce to you my colleague and friend, Desirée Cormier-Smith, the first U.S. Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice, to offer opening remarks.
Thank you, Monique. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name, as Monique said, is Desirée Cormier-Smith, and I'm honored to be the State Department's first ever Special Representative for Racial Equity and Justice. My mandate, thank you. The first, but hopefully not the last. My mandate as Special Representative is twofold. First is to ensure U.S. foreign policy, programs, assistance, processes protect and advance the human rights of members of marginalized racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, including people of African descent, and to build global partnerships to combat structural racism, discrimination, and xenophobia around the world. To be clear, my mandate and my position were not created because we think we have already solved these challenges in the United States. Rather, my position was created because we recognize that we are not the only country struggling with these challenges. Racial inequity is a global challenge that knows no borders, and the global scourges of racism, discrimination, and xenophobia require urgent, coordinated, and sustained global solutions. When I was appointed to this position in June of 2022, I joined a cadre of colleagues throughout the U.S. federal government whose job it became to do this equity work because of the language in the executive order that President Biden signed. The U.S. took a whole-of-government approach to combating these global scourges. To that end, I'm excited to introduce these four esteemed panelists and our fantastic moderator who will lead us in a conversation on the way forward. Catherine Lhamon is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, where she has served since the United States Senate confirmed her in October 2021, following President Biden's nomination of her in May of 2021. Amber Greene serves as Special Assistant to the President for Racial and Economic Justice on the Domestic Policy Council at the White House. Amber has an extensive history of working on social justice issues. Ambassador Patrick Gaspard is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for American Progress and the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Previously, Gaspard served as U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa from 2013 to 2016, where I had the honor and privilege of working for him while he was ambassador. And last but certainly not least, Sakira Cook is the Federal Policy Director for the Southern Poverty Law Center and its lobbying arm, the SPLC Action Fund. Sakira leads the federal policy team in Washington, D.C., and guides the development and implementation of legislative, executive, and national coalition advocacy strategies. Finally, our moderator, Monique Dixon, serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. The floor is yours, Monique, and I look forward to this discussion.
All right, thank you so much. So let's get started. Panelists, thank you for being here today. And just so that the audience knows, we will begin the discussion. I'll spend maybe 30 minutes having a discussion with panelists, and then we'll open up for questions. You'll be able to join us soon thereafter. So to get started, I want to talk about the challenges that Black or African American students have faced and continue to face in the United States educational system. So let's have Assistant Secretary Lhamon and Director Cook get us started.
Thanks so much, Monique, and thank you all for joining us. I will start by just talking about the urgency of this moment, and I think we heard it yesterday. I know that's why we are all here today. All 600 people in the office that I lead know it too, and we know that there is no child who has a minute of learning to lose in school. We are using every tool that we have to make sure that we actually live the promise that Congress has given to all American students for now 6 decades, that no person will experience discrimination in school on the basis of race, color, and national origin. Last year alone, my office resolved 3,001 investigations related to race discrimination in schools. And we also issue policy guidance, and we collect and we publish data about the experience of students in every school in the country. I'm going to start with the data and then talk a little bit about the enforcement and the policy work also. But the data reflect that about 40% of Black students in public schools in the United States go to school where 3/4 or more of the students in their schools are students of color. So we have widespread segregation in our schools again, and we know that the quality of school offerings in the schools that are so segregated in the United States are also unequal and also raise serious concerns. Black students are 15% of students in the public schools in the United States. And we know, for example, just to share tiny quantum of our data, that they are 6% of students who are taking advanced placement mathematics and 8% of students who are taking advanced placement science. So that means for us that we have a distance yet to travel to make sure that every student in every school has an equal opportunity to access education and is supported as the rich learner that every student is. So we also are investigating experiences of discrimination and resolving those experiences. Our office is charged by Congress to make sure that no student experiences discrimination in school, and if a school community refuses to live up to that promise, then our tool is to withhold federal funds from them. And I will say to you, I would be delighted to take away federal funds from anybody who hurts a kid. So just to give a couple examples, last month we resolved an investigation in a school district in Utah that has less than 0.5% of students who are Black in the school. And it had rampant race discrimination, including calling students the N-word, promising to bring back slavery, calling students cotton picker, repeatedly reported to the school leadership, and the schools not responding, not investigating necessarily every time, and when investigating, not taking sufficient steps to make sure that students have equal access to education. I am very pleased to report to you that that school district now has a robust agreement, subject to federal monitoring, which will take place for years, to make sure that that kind of experience does not occur anymore, and that those students actually experience at the desktop the equality that Congress has promised for them. It is our goal to be there for every student who needs us. Thank you. Every day, in every school. And we feel the seriousness of the moment because we know no student gets back the time before they experience discrimination. So we want to make sure that schools know how to comply with the law, know what to do to comply with the law. Monique is the chief of the policy section in our unit. So she has been very aggressive in publishing, generating policy documents that talk about race discrimination in school discipline, race discrimination in access to high rigor coursework, race discrimination in evaluating students whether they have a disability or not, making sure that every aspect of the ways that students experience school actually is equal for them. So we're sharing that information with school communities to incent greater compliance. So I say those things to say, again, we are using every tool we have, aware that every day is a new opportunity to discriminate, and we need to be there to make sure no one experiences it.
Hi,
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Monique, for that question. One of the issues that I want to pull on that Catherine mentioned was around the disproportionate rates in which Black students experience discipline policy in the United States, especially in the Deep South, where SPLC is based. We are based in 5 states: Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. And throughout those states, we have seen that Black students experience higher rates of suspension and expulsion due to discretionary discipline policy. And this is an area that the Department of Justice has looked at over time, but of course, you know, as administrations change in the federal government, those policies change, right? And so one of the things we've been pushing the Department of Justice to do is to update guidance on the use of school discipline across the country, right? To be explicit about the fact that all students should be treated fairly and equitably. Schools should be a safe place, and we should not be pushing students out into the youth justice systems for minor infractions, right? In Alabama, and I want to point you all to something. We started a research project. My colleague Delvin Davis, who's here in the room, has issued 3 of these reports, Only Young Once. And this is a series that really chronicles the ways in which youth in Alabama, in Louisiana, and in Mississippi experience disproportionate discipline rates, expulsion, and suspension. And what we've learned is that we are pushing kids out of school and into the criminal legal system, pushing them into adult facilities. And we're spending about $150,000 to $160,000 to incarcerate youth, right? Compared to what we spend to educate them in those same states, right? Around $12,000 to educate a youth. Compared to what we could be spending around rehabilitation services for those children, around $20,000. Compared to sending them to college for free, around $25,000. So imagine, right, to spend 3 times the amount it would cost you to educate a child through K through 12, to send them to college, to give them the types of supportive things that they need at home, right? Trauma-informed care, supportive in-school counselors and mental health professionals. We want to spend $160,000. And so this is an issue that we are actively engaged on at the state level, looking to change the laws in our states to provide more due process to parents and students as it relates to these discipline policies, but also to push the federal government to step in where they can and provide updated, strong guidance that limits the ability of school districts across the country, but also in the Deep South, where we see the highest rates of suspension and expulsion, to ensure that that doesn't happen anymore.
I'll just jump in to correct my friend to say that we did issue guidance on that topic, and we are very pleased. We appreciated the push, and it's very recent, and we also think that this is an enormously consequential issue.
Amber, and then we'll move on to the next. Sorry, Amber, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very pleased to speak with you all this afternoon. I'd say a couple of the other issues, in addition to the issues shared by fellow panelists here. I'd also say supporting students in their academic success coming out of COVID, which includes their mental health and well-being. Youth particularly have been impacted through losses from COVID. Disruptions in routines and relationships have led to social isolation, anxiety, learning loss, and sadly suicide for a lot of our youth. And so those are some specific areas that we've tried to address. $2 billion to support school-based mental health, hiring 14,000 new school counselors, providing states with specific actions that they can take to increase attendance, expand tutoring, provide summer and after-school time learning. But also, I think one other area that is particularly important is the importance of teacher diversity. Right now, there are about 50% of American students are students of color, but less than 20% of the educated workforce are teachers of color. Black teachers specifically are declining, and that, oh, can you all hear me okay? So Black teachers are specifically declining, thank you. And so we've taken a lot of action to try to address those clear disparities, because when you have more diverse teachers, you have a greater learning experience for students, right? Everyone can think about a teacher that really made a difference in their lives. And whether they were a person of color or not, having that diversity of thought, having that diversity of experience really helps to provide a well-rounded education. So we've taken action to encourage. About 30 states and DC have actually worked to increase teacher pay. We've implemented student loan repayment plans to ensure that people can actually enter the teaching profession. That's a big barrier, especially for people of color, ensuring that we provide those resources there. And also have been expanding grant programs which specifically target teaching for HBCUs and MSIs and Hispanic serving institutions to provide funding to ensure that we have grant programs that support their opportunities to become teachers. So we're really trying to take a well-rounded approach in terms of those spaces to ensure that we are meeting the needs of students, not only through their mental health and well-being, but also thinking about the climate in which they learn. And so those are some of the areas and a number of things that we're doing, but just wanted to share that.
Thank you so much. So let's move on to the next questions. We know that in the United States, there are some schools and colleges and universities that have developed curricula or engaged in educational programs and activities that promote racially diverse and inclusive school communities, while other educational agencies and schools have taken steps to ban curricula, books, and student groups that focus on the experiences of Black or African American people. So let's pivot the discussion a little bit to talk about the importance of students learning about all races, nationalities, and cultures in school. And Ambassador Gaspard, let's start that discussion with you.
Thank you so much for inviting me in to enter at that point. I appreciate the framing of the question, but I want to do a thing, and I just kind of collapse the question for a second, because the way it's articulated, it sounds as if we have a universe of schools that are making one decision, and then a separate and distinct universe of schools that are making another decision altogether. What we're faced with in the U.S., and I'm telescoping out because we have many friends here who are not from the U.S., and I want to give you a little sense of our context. What we're faced with in the U.S. is not that neat a split screen. We have to understand that the latter is occurring precisely because of the former, right? We have many schools across the country at the level of primary education and higher education who recognize that America is changing rapidly. We are becoming more and more diverse. My two children are part of the most diverse generation that we've ever had in America. And there are some school systems, there are institutions that are racing to keep up with the transformation in society. As a consequence, as a direct consequence of the decisions made by those institutions, particularly coming out of the moment of racial reckoning that we had in the U.S. and in other parts of the world following the George Floyd moment, there's been a transformation and a commitment made, but there's been a pushback to that transformation, a pushback to that commitment. Those of you who are not from the U.S. may not know that in 2020, the President of the United States, then Donald Trump, signed an executive order banning diversity and inclusion training in U.S. federal government and precisely targeting education and the resources that move from the federal government into the states around education. As a consequence, subsequent to that executive order and between that moment and this moment, there are 44 state legislatures that in some fashion have introduced some bans to what they call critical race theory, which is an academic theory some decades old that is not taught in any primary education center anywhere in America, but it's part of the pushback to the pushback. It's a weaponization of education in America. I'm not in government anymore, so I can say things like this. It's a weaponization of education in America, and it precisely overwhelmingly target spaces where children of color are attempting to gain their full opportunity and their full access. As a result of those 44 state legislatures that have introduced some kind of a measure, 18 states have actually passed some bans, some censorship that's had a direct impact on the ability not just of Black students, but of all children to get an accurate sense of their community, their true history, and to take up a sense of agency over the future in our country. We know that as a consequence of things like the Brown versus Board ruling 70 years ago, that progress happens, but sometimes we have to impose our will on the arc of history, and there are people who are doing that every day in the country. So to go precisely to the question, we have seen study after study that's demonstrated higher student performance as a result of diverse curriculum, as a result of all students, children of color, our girls students, LGBTQ students, being able to see themselves in the curriculum, being able to hear themselves in the classroom. A recent study out of Stanford demonstrated not only higher educational attainment as a consequence of that, but better mental health outcomes for our children as well. And we all recognize how much that matters. So just want you to appreciate that the conversation that's happening in the U.S. right now is profoundly fraught. There are polemics that are driving all of it, how it gets expressed in popular media and how it gets expressed in the halls of Congress is really governed and determined by a set of political outcomes that some folks are trying to drive to at this moment.
Any other panelists want to chime in?
I'm happy to jump in also. We have a book ban coordinator at the Department of Education whose job it is to make sure that the coordinator is sharing information with school communities all over the country about the harm to students of banning books, the harm to students of, and the ways that so banning the books can feed into and cause race discrimination in school. We also investigate that topic. We don't have jurisdiction in our office over the curriculum that is offered in schools, but we do have jurisdiction over the operation of a racially hostile environment in school. And we resolved an investigation of a Georgia school district where the books that had been taken off the library shelves were principally books by Toni Morrison, who was a Black American author, books by other Black American authors, and books by and about LGBTQI plus people. And we had evidence from students. They had testified to their school board that they felt like they couldn't be themselves at school. They felt like they weren't sure it was okay to check out books that they were interested in about themselves or about other people that they wanted to learn about. They didn't feel safe at school anymore because these books had been removed and there was no conversation with the students about what the process was for removal, whether the books would be coming back, whether it was okay for the students to express themselves at school. That's a core civil rights issue. And we resolved this investigation with an agreement from the district that they would share resources for students to support them in school, that they would communicate their non-discriminatory values to students at school, and that they would make sure that every student would be safe at school. That's the law. We're very happy to enforce it, and we are such strong believers in the importance of an equal message to all students and the value of telling the truth about our history. I met, just as this panel was starting, one of the survivors, the descendants of the survivors of the Tulsa race massacre, which is now 102 years ago in the United States history. And I was part of President Biden's visit for the 100th anniversary to Tulsa about that massacre. President Biden said there that great nations do not hide from their past. And we are a great nation. So we need to be able to teach the good, the bad, the ugly about our history, learn from it, and not repeat it. That's our goal for our students in school.
Okay, Ambassador, and then Director Cook, right?
I just wanted to add a quick point and some further context in commending the Assistant Secretary on her words, but also on her conviction, which shows up every single day in the work. Again, context for our friends here. Understand that 80% of the book bans that we've tracked across the country are in the Deep South. 80% of these book bans. And, it tells you something about a pernicious kind of insidious history. I also want you to know that all of this is happening at a moment of profound transformation in the country. And I'll give you two data points quickly on the transformation. We know, and those of you outside of the U.S. may not know this, but by 2040, the United States will be a majority-minority nation. What does that mean right now in this moment? If you go to a state like Iowa, where you have a rapidly aging population, overwhelmingly white state, but the majority of children who attend Des Moines, Iowa public schools right now today are children of color. Right? So you're racing towards a 2040 minority-majority country, but in 2040, the U.S. for the first time will have more people over the age of 64 than under the age of 18. So you have these generations, these demographics, these cultures that are encountering one another in our public institutions, in our schools, litigated through education. And if we're not preparing for that moment now, as the Assistant Secretary is earnestly working to prepare us for that moment, that can lead to culture clash instead of culture integration and culture empowerment.
Yes, okay. Well, Patrick actually picked up on something I was going to say about the Deep South, because that's where we are and have been tracking these bills. But I want to pull on a thread that he just left off on. SPLC has been tracking for over, 30 or 40 years, hate groups and extremism in the United States, but also internationally. And so the additional context that has to undergird this conversation about the erasure, that's what this is, right? The attempt to erase Black history, the attempt to erase the legacies of enslavement in the United States and the ways in which that has birthed, right, structural racism and discrimination and inequity, and the ways in which the civil rights movement was birthed to fight and push against that and to make progress like we have, right? This is an attempt to roll that back. And that attempt is intentional, and it is being led by actors who are very extreme. Groups, hate groups and extremist groups who we track, who show up as, pin themselves as parents' rights advocates, but they are not. They actually want to return us to a time where Black people were subjugated, right? Black people especially, but other people of color, as Patrick said, who are now going to be the majority in the United States. And that's to maintain power. That's to maintain the status quo and the power structures that exist in our society with respect to education, with respect to housing, employment, et cetera, all things that lead to economic opportunity, right, and lead to a democracy that is more inclusive, more equitable, and that believes in justice and equality for all. And that's really what's animating a lot of what's going on in the U.S. and has animated it from from its inception, right? We can't deny that this is what is at the core and at the root of who the United States has been. But people like us have always shown up to fight back against that, and that's what's really important.
Sorry, I'm not a panelist, but I have to just pick up. I just have to pick up on something Sakira said, because it's so important, and one of the reasons why we wanted to do this panel here. Because while we see these groups in the United States as they are increasingly and exceptionally organized, they're also very well funded, but they are not limiting their work to the United States, right? As Sakira mentioned, they are global, and so we know we're centering this conversation on the United States, but not because it's only a problem in the United States. We know that this is a global problem, and for better or worse, what happens in the United States often doesn't stay in the United States. So we've seen the export of these hate groups. We've seen the export of these practices. And so this is why I was so thrilled that we can have this conversation, because this is a global challenge. And while it is really reaching a boiling point in our country, we're also seeing it across Latin America, across Africa, across Europe, across every region of the world, because these other organizations that are, again, trying to push us back are increasingly globally connected. And so I really want to just underscore that point, that this conversation, we are talking about the United States, but not because this is only a problem in the United States.
Okay, so let's shift a little bit to focus on institutions of higher education, colleges and universities. So just in terms of background, in June 2023, the United States Supreme Court announced its ruling in the cases of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard College and Students for Fair Admissions versus the University of North Carolina. In that case, the court held that the school's consideration of race as one of a student's race as one of many factors in admissions was unconstitutional and also violates federal civil rights law, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So by doing so, the decision restricts the approaches that many colleges and universities have used for decades to ensure that its students benefit from having diverse student bodies. Before and after the holding, civil society and others were concerned that it would have an impact on Black and African American students. So my question for the panel is, what impact has the court's decision had on Black and African American students' admissions to colleges or universities, and what steps have you taken to ensure that all students have equal access to higher ed? And let's see, let's start with Special Assistant Greene for that one.
Okay. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? So, as was mentioned, so for over 40 years, affirmative action had been a tool that the U.S. had used to open up doors of higher education that have long been held shut. And the people that primarily benefited from the affirmative action work were people of color and women. Courts further ruled that colleges could use race as not just the determinant factor, but one of many factors in the admissions process when admitting qualified students. And I want to emphasize qualified, because that's some of the myths that we need to think about dispelling. Many people think that students that were admitted to highly selective programs and schools were solely there because of their race, and that is a false narrative. On the flip side, however, for years, students have been admitted to those same institutions because they were a child of a donor or a legacy, and they were admitted to those schools. And that type of affirmative action, courts don't have a problem with. So when we think about the challenges that our students are facing right now, we have to think about some of the actions that we've taken. And I know that the Department of Education, Assistant Secretary Lhamon will also share some of the actions that the Education Department took with regard to admissions guidance, hosting a national summit and other spaces there. But one of the things that I wanted to share is that a lot of our students, and I'm also a product of a predominantly white institution, many Black students have frankly felt unwelcomed at these schools. And that's why diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have been so important to those institutions, because they create a sense of belonging. And when we don't have programs, when we don't have opportunities there, it definitely creates a lot of tensions within those schools. So right now, we will see what our admissions new class looks like. One of the requirements that the president had called on was additional data on race and ethnicity with regard to admissions, as well as the application rate, so we can actually see where people are applying to, where they are getting into those programs. But we won't see, I don't think, the impacts for quite a while in terms of some of the data. So we've been spending a lot of time working with institutions, colleges, and others to make sure that they do not roll back on their programs, that they commit even further. And we've seen schools that are highly selective specifically making those changes and making a real concerted effort to improve their outreach and retention programs so that students feel welcomed and want to come to those institutions. But I will say that one of the things that we've also taken a big step in is to further strengthen historically Black colleges and universities. HBCUs produce 50% of all Black, HBCUs there, okay, you can clap. HBCUs produce over 50% of all educators, 40% of all Black engineers, 70% of all Black doctors and dentists, and 80% of all Black judges. And that tells you something in terms of when students are able to just be themselves and go to schools and not have to deal with feeling, that they don't belong. And so we're really proud of our record to be able to deliver over $7 million to HBCUs to ensure that the doors of opportunity remain open, but there is still a lot that we must continue to do so that these doors don't remain shut. The institutions that are really highly selective produce overwhelmingly a lot of the folks that are leading our society. And we want to make sure that those students, all of our students, have more opportunities to learn together. The more that we are able to sit down and learn from one another, discuss tough issues, those are the types of things that break down biases and further our goals as a democracy. And so that's what we're trying to ensure that we continue to promote. Yes, there will be challenges, but we are in it to ensure that every student has opportunity to go to school that they would like to go to.
I'll jump in there also just to say that this is an active area of enforcement for us also at the Department of Education. We have 16 investigations open now specifically about the issue of legacy admissions and whether it redounds to the detriment of Black students in schools and whether that's a form of discrimination that we should be addressing. So I take the point that the courts have not been interested yet, but I think they will be interested now. And we are very, very clear after the Students for Fair Admissions decision that the court overruled the use of a particular practice that many schools had been using in selective admissions. It did not say that the pursuit of diversity is unlawful. It did not say that there is no way to achieve diverse student bodies. It is not a foregone conclusion now that our Black students will not achieve and succeed and graduate from the institutions of their dreams moving forward. And we will be there to make sure that those schools admit them, that they support them, they graduate them, and those kids are ready to lead for our future. So we are actively investigating the space. We shared resources together with the Department of Justice just weeks after the decision to talk about what's lawful still, to talk about what paths are available now. Schools can access data to assess whether their paths are successful. They can take lawful steps considering race in their recruitment and in their outreach. They can, for example, recruit from schools that they haven't historically been looking at to find students who can succeed in their communities. And we've seen really amazing changes already in this first year. Amber's quite right that we don't know yet what the impact of the decision is. We know what it doesn't have to be, and we know what we're ready to make sure doesn't happen in schools. We also know that we see schools in the United States taking innovative steps to make sure that they are accepting, admitting, supporting fully inclusive school communities. There's a college system in California that has guaranteed admission for students from high schools in 29 school districts around that college. If they get a C grade, which is the average grade or higher, and they meet the minimum eligibility requirements for the school, they are guaranteed admission. They tell those kids that in 11th grade. They tell those kids before they've graduated high school, you are one of us, college is for you. And they tell them as they're starting high school that they can come, they can take courses, enrichment courses in the summer to experience what college would be like, to see what it means to be in that school, to imagine their futures at that college. So they know before they finish high school, you are a college student. There's other colleges that have recognized the data that we have about schools that don't offer high rigor courses. They don't offer advanced math. They're not offering advanced science. And so those schools say, okay, if your school didn't offer it, then you don't have to take it to be able to come to our college. And we will find another way to recognize your success and your potential, and we will welcome you here. So there are lots of different changes that we are already seeing in the country about colleges that are committed to diverse schooling, finding ways still to make sure that they have those kids come and they support them so they succeed.
Want to put a pin in one particular demographic, and that's African American men. So we, as the Assistant Secretary said, it's far too early for us to be able to track data coming off of the court ruling, but there is some data that is really pronounced that we need to be paying special consideration to now. There's a recent Reuters study that demonstrated that 45% of African American students in the U.S. are reporting that they're considering, this is university students, are considering stopping their studies. That's twice the national average. And coming out of the pandemic, we have seen a 14% decline in Black male enrollment in colleges, and that number jumps up to 25% if you're just counting two-year colleges, community colleges. It's an astounding drop-off coming off of the pandemic. There's special consideration that needs to go to that universe. I will tell you, as somebody who's had to take a young Black man through the school system in the U.S., there's discouragement at every turn that I'm inspired to know that there are folks like the Assistant Secretary working on it. I will never forget going to the school that my son attended, and you come doing you're doing your parent rounds if you're being attentive, and you realize that your son is suddenly in a room with nothing other than other Black men, young Black men in that room, and you ask why all of these students are being put together, and you're told where they're on a particular learning track, and then you discover that that track is not the same for the majority of other students in the school. You pull your kid out if you have the means and the resources to do that. Far too many of us don't have those means and those resources, and the numbers that we're seeing post-pandemic are troubling, and we have to pay special attention to them.
Thank you, panelists. So we're going to open the floor for questions. I have one final question for our panelists, so please don't leave because I think their responses may be helpful to you, but in the interest of time, we want to open up for questions. So when I call on you, as you know, you'll need to hit the red button on your microphone, And please state your name and affiliation, and I will take a few questions at a time. Please be brief so that we can get through as many as we can. So I will start from this person here with the yellow scarf on, yes, and the gentleman in the back on that side. And which one?
The lady in the black. Did you still have a question, ma'am? Yes.
Okay, yes. So 1, 2, 3.
I'm the.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Annette. Can you? No, you go. No, your mic is on. Oh, okay, I got you. Okay, Annette Williams. I'm from the Reparations Finance Lab, and my work is specifically, particularly around private capital and reparations, and looking at how to engage private capital. In education, we know that much of the disparity, especially K through 10, comes from the way in which that's financed, which is, through the property tax system and sort of local systems. As we seek to repair and create framework for more equitable investment in education, what are some ideas and strategies so that's not dependent on a poor Black community, which is historically poor, right? So that they have resources equitable to a wealthier community.
I'll take the other two questions.
There we go. Now we're in business. Hi. My name is Consa Jones-Muhammad. I'm the president of the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants. I have two questions. One, you all talked about data collection, and there is a civil rights compliance clause in the OMB Standard 15, which talks about how data is collected. Currently, there is no data collection on the descendants of persons enslaved in the United States, so I'd like to know how we can move that agenda with all of you from the educational side of life. Two, California, I'm giving you two examples. California State Governor and North Carolina State Governor. California Governor Newsom actually changed legislation that Dr. Shirley Weber wrote that would have tracked grant dollars going to underperforming students, and when it got to Newsom's desk, he did a slight change of hand and he changed it to the lowest income schools. So how do we defend when it's not a school district and it is a governor? And then with Halifax County in North Carolina, Halifax is townships, predominantly historically Black. They sued the state for underfunding of the Black students, and when they won their case, that governor last year decided that he was going to spread the money around all of Halifax County and not the schools affected. So if you can talk to, again, how we seek justice from those governors when they change things that negatively impact, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Anthony Morgan. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto Centre for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies. I'm an international human rights lawyer and advocate. One of the things I've been privileged to do is be trained by Professor Ann Skelton, who is the chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And one of the things she's been keen to remind folks of is that the U.S. is the only country in the world that hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so I'm wondering if this conversation which is essentially, I think, can be framed as a human rights attack on children, has spurred any conversation or thought on the U.S. joining the rest of the global community and signing the Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Thank you. So, we have three questions. One about the funding of schools K through 12. What strategies are in place to ensure that the schools are not financed by taxes, local taxes, state taxes? Data collection on disaggregated by descendants of Africans, and the U.S.'s status in terms of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So any panelist can take any question in any order.
Well, I'll jump in on the first two, and I will defer on the last one. But on the resource equity question, on the funding for schools, we have jurisdiction over that too. So we are very pleased to investigate when schools discriminate in their resource allocation of dollars, and separate and apart from the dollars, the teachers, the materials for schooling, instructional materials, and the quality of school facilities. All of those are things that we do address. And when we find that there are race disparities, race discrimination in the allocation of those resources, we are again very poised to take away federal funds unless that gets corrected. So it's an active enforcement area for us also. It's also something that we in the federal government, we across the country, Black people across the nation have been watching for too long, that the funding processes for schools and then the allocation of resources separate and apart from the dollars cause inequity and raise very serious questions. I'll just give you a tiny example of a case that we're working on resolving now. This is in the southern state. The school district offers very unequal athletics opportunities, and that's partly about the booster funding for those opportunities. And the white and wealthy schools have amazing fields, amazing facilities, and the schools that Black kids attend don't. And that will change soon. So those are kinds of issues that we do address. On the question of whether a governor is the instigator for a concern or a local community, all those are recipients of federal funds, and the guarantee, the condition of receiving federal funds is that discrimination does not follow. It's what President Kennedy called simple justice. So where there is a governor who is the cause of discriminatory action, we have jurisdiction over that too, and we are very pleased to investigate that question as well. So the structure of the muscular arm of the federal government is dependent on our ability and willingness to wield it, and I commit to you that I am.
Can you hear me okay? Just to follow up on what the Assistant Secretary said. So we have invested the most out of any administration in terms of funding for schools, $130 billion that has gone to schools to ensure that there's more equity in programs that reach children, that reach ensure teachers and counselors and all of those areas that are really critical to our schools. But one of the things that we're really in charge of making sure that we see moving forward is through our Investing in America agenda, which those resources are going directly, some are going directly to, states and localities. And absolutely right, we would like to know if, there are instances of other funding as well where those funds are not reaching people, because that's clearly our goal is to make sure that those dollars that we've gotten through Congress are actually reaching the communities that are in need most. And then regarding SPD 15, I believe that was just finalized about 2 weeks ago, so I can follow up with you afterwards to see if there's other mechanisms to address any of the outstanding concerns that weren't resolved through the public comment period, because we received about 20,000 comments. Well, not we, OMB received about 20,000 comments from across the country trying to redefine race and ethnicity standards. This was the first time that it was updated in about 25 years so that we could have a more accurate counting and understand disaggregated data better, but happy to follow up with you about that question.
I want to just touch quickly on the California specific question, because I find it to be really a fascinating instance as somebody who's an organizer. So African American students make up, I think, a little bit like 6% of all the students in the public school system in California. That's 6% of like 5.9 million school kids in that system in California, but 70% of all of the African American students in the public school system in California qualify as low income, right? So that $400 million that was targeted at low-income students would have disproportionately benefited those African American kids and really would have made a catalytic difference. As I understood it, as somebody who followed from across the country, the argument that was being made by some in the media, by lawyers in the State House, some people around the governor, is that Proposition 209 that was passed in the 1990s would have preempted this bill, because 209 said specifically that the state can't allocate any of its resources in a way that gives preferential treatment to any particular group. So that prop was being used. It was used by Governor Jerry Brown in 2018 when a similar bill was on his desk, and again, it was used by Newsom's administration. It was interesting to follow it precisely because those who were the sponsors and co-sponsors of the bill tabled the bill without going back to, again, as I understood it, tabled it without going back to their coalitions with any kind of, with any transparency, and there was this kind of dead of night accord that was signed with the governor, and the debate was shifted from the legislative cycle to the budget cycle, which disadvantages the kind of outcomes that we would want in our communities. I followed it closely as an organizer, as an activist around these issues, because for me, it just seemed to boil down to a question of power. Who has it? Who's able to leverage it? Particularly, who's able to create a sense of accountability in election cycles that then gets translated to moments of accountability in legislative cycles, right? And if there had been, in the course of Newsom's campaign, I think a specific conversation that socialized the notion of this investment, there would have been a public commitment made by candidates that would be very, very difficult for them to walk back from. When these things happen only in the legislative cycle, then you don't get the kind of power invested behind the question that and mobilization that one needs. It is a tricky thing to manage in state capitals and in those corridors of power. But one that utterly fascinates me, and I'm thinking all the time from my perch at the Center for American Progress, how we lift up these issues, expose the challenge that community groups have in trying to move their state capitals in ways that will specifically enable the targeting of resources to our communities in that fashion. But that Prop 209 thing, that's a Trojan horse. Would love to be able to talk to you about that after.
Sakira, did you want to jump in on any other questions? No? Okay. I will briefly answer the question that Anthony posed on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it will be a deeply unsatisfactory answer. The U.S. has signed it, but ratification of treaties require 2/3 of the Senate, and we just don't have that right now. And I'm happy to talk to you offline, but right now it's just not. It just talks to the deeply polarized moment that we're in. It's very unfortunate.
So I have a question. And the woman in the pink in the back, thank you for your question. Oh.
Hello, my name is Sakira Irvin. I'm with the Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center. I'm a former teacher of 7 years in public schools. You all mentioned the need to continue to try to diversify the teaching workforce in the U.S. And my experience and the experience of many other people who go into education as a Black American is that we go in trying to make a difference for children like us, and then we end up experiencing a lot of workplace violence, a lot of the discrimination, a lot of the microaggressions that we're trying to minimize for the students. So how do you increase that diversity without setting those teachers up for failure and for violence in the workplace?
One panelist could answer.
Okay. Well, increasing diversity decreases the pressure on the one of us who has to speak for all of us. And so that, that there's a value of having more of us, so we may have different views, we may have different thoughts about how we'll approach things, and we don't hold all of the responsibility to speak for all Black people when there's someone else who can take some of the conversation as well. So there's reasons from the perspective of the benefit to students of seeing someone like them who leads like them so they can imagine themselves in their future. There's also reasons for the benefit of the staying power of people who enter the profession and may stay in the profession because there's more of them, and because we don't ask them to do something other than the teaching and leading the classroom, the instructional leadership that is what sent you into teaching. So there's values both ways for it. We are investing, as the White House has mentioned, we are investing in teacher diversity, trying to make sure that we see more people coming to and staying in schools. We're working on supporting school communities. We issued policy guidance that reaffirms the lawfulness of DEI practices in schools, and that there is no categorical conflict between the non-discrimination laws that we enforce and DEI practices to encourage the use of those practices in schools, and that goes to supporting the educators, supporting the people who are in those programs as well. So we are eyes right on it and right with you on what the harm is and the pressure to leave because it's too hard to stay.
Thank you for that. So the last question that I'd like to present to the panel is, what advice would you offer to nations that are also working to ensure that their students have equal educational opportunities without regard to race? So this is for all panelists.
So I would say the first thing is to involve young people in the decision-making process. I think it's really critically important that we hear from young people, hear from students in terms of how they are impacted, the types of ways that they can support the work that we're trying to do. And I think that is critically important to make sure that their voice is centered in the discussions, and also more, cross-racial solidarity in the fight. There's more of us that, in this country and globally, that value diversity, that value having diverse voices around the table. And so we all have to stand united in that fight against folks that would like to roll back progress.
I'll share advice too, and my key advice is do it. It doesn't really matter how, it doesn't really matter which intervention you take, just do it, because we need it. We know that schools are places where people learn to read, to write, to think, but they're also places where they learn their value in the world. They're the places where they learn that their government does or does not value them, where they learn whether there are expectations for their success. We need to be communicating that because we want to communicate a value from the students as they grow up to participate in democratic institutions, to participate in their societies, so that they are giving back, so that they are public servants themselves. If we don't support them in school, they don't grow up to become those people. So what we have to do is do it. We have to do it with urgency. We need people to be educated, and we need people to be educated about their worth and to receive the message that we want them to see in school. So for me, we have to throw everything we have at it, and any intervention you take is worthwhile.
I'd say be really careful and clear in understanding precisely what the challenge is that you're trying to solve for in your locale. There are many different ways to approach the question of diversity. I think sometimes we don't pay enough attention to socioeconomic diversity in where our children learn and who's teaching our children. It's a significant issue that needs to be taken head on. When I served, before I served in South Africa, I first went into the country in 1990, right at the tail end of the tip over in apartheid. There were these teacher training colleges that lacked diversity and that really reinforced the Bantustan education in the country. When the ANC came into power, they disbanded the teacher training colleges and never managed to make an equivalent investment in new institutions that they could stand up again to create quality in the school system and the diversity that they were seeking. And so fast forward some decades later, and they're not getting the outcomes in the school system that they want for desperately poor students in the school system. So we have to think about what diversity means and make a set of investments that accompany that challenge. I want to just very, very quickly also speak to the previous question about diversity in our teachers in the U.S. Let's pay them more. If we pay more, we'll get black people wanting to do these jobs. There are 55,000 teacher vacancies in America and 270,000 teachers that are working below the level of qualification that we want them to have in these systems. And most teachers, when surveyed, say they would not recommend the job to others. That's a big freaking deal. Pay more money, we'll get the diversity we need.
Okay. So I think one of the most important things, and we've seen this in the United States and how it impacts the ways in which access to opportunity happens for Black people, is a robust civil society, right? In the ways in which advocates, parents, community, students, right, involve themselves in the political process in our country and push the government where appropriate to do what's right and to do what's in the best interest of everyone, including especially those who are often pushed to the margins. But you have to have the structures, right, in place to facilitate that engagement, right? If we did not have a civil rights division in the U.S. and in every agency, pretty much, in the United States, we would be at a disadvantage, right, in being able to ensure that laws and policies and practices are actually impacting people in the right way. And that's really important. So your countries have to have the laws in place, right, the systems and the structures inside of government where civil society can engage, where they can talk to people in the government every day and push them in that way, and they can access the courts. At Southern Poverty Law Center, we use every tool available, right? We litigate every issue that I talked about, school inclusion, discipline, even DEIA. We are actively in the court systems advocating on behalf of people. We are pushing policy change with our legislators, with people in the administration to ensure that Black and brown people have the access that they need. And we're organizing and working in coalition and working across borders to do that. And I think that's also very important. So use the opportunity here at the Permanent Forum to make those types of connections, not only in your own country, but also across, right? I think we all saw what 2020 birthed after the unfortunate killing of George Floyd. It was a global movement, right, where people were commanding that countries across the world who have legacies of enslavement, colonialism, racism, anti-Blackness, work to advance some of the same issues. What's happening in the U.S. is true in many, many other places across the globe, and it's important that we maintain those bonds and work collectively to advance them. Sorry, Monique.
Well, everyone, thank you so much to the panelists and to all of you for a thoughtful conversation this afternoon. We hope that the exchange of ideas, experiences, and information has contributed to our common goal of ensuring access to education and promoting racial equity. Thank you so much for your time, for staying to the end, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the Permanent Forum. Have a good day.